Is everybody in? How do you know? Everyone's in, we can start?
They're coming in, so just
Oh,
give them
okay.
a
All
couple of minutes.
right. Oh, hi, everyone. Thanks for being here. A little bit of an awkward setup. I'll explain it in a minute here. That's why we can't see who's coming in. But thanks for being here. We're going to wait a little bit for the last minute people coming in to join the talk. Oh, okay. All right. Sorry. All right, everyone. Thanks for joining us tonight. We're going to get started here. Just a little bit of housekeeping tonight. We had such a huge turnout for this event that we ended up having to use a different workplace platform webinar. And there is no chat. It's disabled. Your microphone's disabled and your video is disabled. If you have questions, down in the bottom center is a Q&A box that you can click on. You can type in your question. And if it's a simple question and it can be answered quickly during the talk, we will, but we're going to save some of the more complex questions till the end for the conversation and discussion part. So with that, I'm going to get started. I wanted to thank everyone for being here virtually. We have a big turnout. We're going to be discussing a project. Myself, I'm Dr. Basil Iannone from the School of Forest, Fisheries, and Geomatic Sciences at the University of Florida. I, along with Dr. Paul Monaghan and Michelle Atkinson, will be presenting on a research project pertaining to stormwater ponds, plants, and people funded by the Department of Environmental Protection. And I also want to thank Rebecca Clapp from the Center for Land Use Efficiency helping us out with the logistics this evening. Okay, I'm going to get started here. And then before we get going, I want to first introduce the team. I already introduced myself. Dr. Paul Monaghan and Michelle Atkinson will introduce themselves as this talk progresses. But I also want to thank Dr. Eben Bean, an engineer who's been helping us with this project, Dr. A.J. Reisinger and Dr. Mary Lust, biogeochemist and aquatic chemistry experts and aquatic ecologist. Dr. Miranda Carver is a research assistant with our team, and then Shimoda Desanayake and Anj Asanzi are both graduate students who've been really kind of doing a lot of work for this project that we're presenting on tonight. So just give you an outline of what I'm going to be discussing. First, I'm going to give you some background. What are the function of stormwater ponds? What are the potential benefits of native plants in stormwater ponds? Then we're going to discuss research findings. I'm going to talk about the effects of plants on water quality, what we found. Paul will be discussing the perception and attitudes about plantings. Michelle will then wrap up with some conclusions and giving you some resources and next steps. And after that, we'll have time for questions. Okay, so we all live in Florida. We all see stormwater ponds. There's a lot of them. And they're doing a very important function. What they're doing is they capture stormwater runoff from urban landscapes. There's a lot of impervious surface in urban landscapes. And by capturing that stormwater runoff that's coming off of our impervious surfaces, it's helping to prevent downstream flooding. And then it also is intended to prevent downstream pollution from entering natural aquatic ecosystems because there's pollution contained in that urban stormwater runoff. Two that we're really concerned with are nutrients, phosphorus and nitrogen, and that's because they can lead to they can degrade aquatic ecosystems a lot. And these ecosystems are of great economic and recreational importance to Florida. So just to give you an idea of how many stormwater ponds there actually are in Florida, if you see this map, the blue dots on this map are stormwater ponds. Dr. Eben Bean and my postdoc James Sinclair mapped the number of stormwater ponds in Florida in 2018. At that time, we estimated there was over 76,000. With the rate of development that's happening, I think it's easy to project that there's 100,000 now in the state. Okay, so there's a lot of them. And then we look at how much area they're taking up relative to other urban land cover types. If you see this graph on the bottom left, stormwater ponds here in blue, there's actually more space they take up than industrial areas in our urban landscapes, and they're actually approaching recreational and open lands as well. So there's a lot of them, and they're taking up a lot of space. That's the key takeaway. So we need to ask, are they doing their job? And if they're accredited for removing 80% of total phosphorus and total nitrogen that enters the pond. Current estimates show that they're not doing their job. Total phosphorus is being removed at about 60 to 65%, whereas total nitrogen is more variable, 12 to 63%. In addition, they can release inorganic forms of nitrogen, and that is forms that are readily available to plants and microbes. And that's because nitrogen fixation occurs in some of these ponds. And actually, there's organic matter, such as leaf litter and yard waste, that get into these ponds and break down over time and convert from organic to inorganic forms. We have other problems with these stormwater ponds as well. Here's one. This is a picture of Lakewood Ranch. Notice the bank erosion here. Okay, what happens here with the bank erosion is the banks erode, that sediment goes into the pond, it creates concerns for water quality. It also creates concern for the filling in of the pond, and also creates safety issues. Mowers mowing along the sides of these banks have actually tipped and killed people. So there's a real safety concern here. And this has been an issue that IFAs has been asked to help with a lot. I'm going to show you here a film that Michelle Atkinson filmed. And what you see is these small waves along the shoreline here. And those small waves over time actually lead to shoreline erosion. And this video shows how plants prevent that. Oh, okay. So sorry about that. There is no sound happening. Sorry. So what is basically shown is where the first part of the video you saw the waves, and here where you see plants up against the banks, you see no waves. So it prevents wave action from eroding the banks. Another issue we get questions about is algae. Algae is a very natural component of ecosystems, aquatic ecosystems, and in fact, in stormwater ponds, it can be quite beneficial because it helps to uptake nutrients. But when you see this much algae in a stormwater pond, you have an issue. There's a lot of nutrients that are available, and there's nothing competing for them, and that's why you get these massive algal blooms. And nobody wants to live on a pond that looks like this. It stinks, and it's just kind of gross. So that's another issue that we've been addressing. So there's been a push to start to think about stormwater pond plantings as a best management practice because we know they can help to stabilize banks. We know that plants uptake nutrients. And we know that plants have a lot of microbes that actually live on their roots that do an even better job of uptaking nutrients in the plants, and they also help to remove nutrients from the pond altogether. And plants can also compete with or hide algae. There's some caveats though. Plants themselves actually senesce on occasion. Their leaf litter dries up, it turns brown, it falls into the water. So they might actually be adding nutrients to the water as well. So we have to confirm that whether or not plants actually remove nutrients. And then there's another issue that Paul has pointed out in his past research that people just don't like them sometimes. They think they look messy and they block their view. So there are three general planting styles that are being promoted or being adopted in Florida generally. The first one is a conventional. That's really just this pond here. Many ponds are like this, just lawns straight up to the pond. Another one that's being promoted is adding a no-mow buffer zone, right? An area where you don't mow. And what that is intended to do is to prevent accidental fertilizers from getting closer to the pond or prevent grass clippings from getting in the pond that are very nutrient rich. And in these ponds that have no mow buffer zones, people are planting the littoral shelves with native plants here. And the littoral shelves are those areas shallow enough for plants to receive light and where plants can grow. A third one that's not really heavily adopted, but Manatee County took it on in some of their municipal ponds, is planting the banks and the littoral zones heavily with native plants. And if you look at this, it kind of looks like more of a natural wetland or a natural pond than a stormwater pond. So we took advantage of that because they did that on 3 ponds now. And we wanted to understand, with these different planting styles being implemented, we wanted to quantify the effects on planting on water quality. And we wanted to learn the perceptions, attitudes, and barriers to adopting these stormwater pond plants as best management practices. And that's the overarching objectives of our study. So I'm going to shift gears now to the water quality aspects of our study. The main questions we're asking here are, do plants on the banks of ponds decrease the amount of nutrients coming into the pond, right? These buffer zones and these bank plantings. And then we want to know, do the aquatic plants, those that are growing out into the water, help to increase nutrient removal? So in order to do this, we selected 8 stormwater ponds in Manatee and Sarasota counties. 3 of them were conventional ponds, just the turf grass banks. 3 were the no-mow buffer zone ponds that had planted littoral shelves. And we only had 2 fully planted ponds because, again, this is not a broadly adopted practice. And what we did is we went to these ponds, and using standard methods from the Army Corps of Engineers, we documented the relative cover of lawns, the relative cover of the no-mow buffer zone and other plants, the bank plantings. Then we also estimated the cover of the aquatic plants, emergent, floating plants, and submerged plants. And we also documented the cover of algae, because algae does have an effect on water quality. And then we use this equipment here that's shown in this picture on the left. This is an auto sampler. Attached to it is a tube going into the center of the pond, and it draws water out of the center of the pond. And on those water samples, we estimated or measured dissolved and particulate total nitrogen and phosphorus from June to September 23rd on 63 storm events. And when you think of dissolved nutrients, think of salt in a warm glass of water. You mix it up, it kind of goes away, but it's there, right? You can see it. You can't see it, but it's there. And these tend to be your inorganic forms of nutrients, phosphorus and nitrogen, that are readily available for plant and microbe uptake. And then particulate is exactly what it sounds like. Particles that have total nitrogen or phosphorus and nitrogen, like think of breaking down leaf tissue or something like that. And it's not as readily, it will break down, become inorganic, in a while, but it's not as readily available to microbes. It's a little harder for them to work for, to get those nutrients, and plants can't get it in that form. And what we did was we measured nutrient concentration at the start of a rain event. And then after the rain stopped, we sampled water from 6, 9 hours, 12 hours, 15, and 18 hours. And then we sampled water again at the start of a new rain event. And then we treated that ending from the sample to the new storm event as the treatment time. That's the amount of time the water was in the pond and for the pond to actually remove the nutrients. And we calculated averages across these sample periods. And based off of that estimate, I'm not going to get into the math up here, but we were able to estimate the rates of influx coming into the pond, how much nutrients were coming in, and how much was being removed. And essentially, a larger value for influx means more stuff is coming into the pond, and a larger value for removal means more stuff's being removed from the pond. Okay, so our hypotheses were that influx will decrease with more bank plants, and removal will increase with more aquatic plants and algae. I put that there because algae is still part of the system and it uptakes nutrients. Okay, so let's get at the results here. First, I'm going to explain this figure. What this shows is dissolved total phosphorus removal rate in percentages for the different ponds. Each of these bars are one of our 8 ponds, and this is the different planting styles. The red line shows 0. Any rate above that, there's removal happening, and any rate above that, there's actually addition of nutrients happening over time. And we saw this was an interesting finding because look how variable they are. For example, this green pond that I'm pointing out right now, some storm events actually had a nearly 100% removal of the total phosphorus, whereas other ponds, it was being added after a storm event up to 2.5 times the amount that was actually in there before the storm event. So there's a lot of variability in the data set, and we're seeing that ponds are not consistently removing nutrients at that 80% threshold. We saw the same effect for all the nutrients we measured. So we wanted to capture some characteristics of the ponds and the storms to kind of control for that variability. We looked at storm characteristics, the intensity, like how much did it rain, the duration, how long did it last. We looked at hydrology, how much the water volume changed. And then we also looked at landscape aspects. And that was the only thing we found affecting our removal and influx rates. NDVI is a satellite image measurement from satellites that just measures greenness essentially, and it just shows how much vegetation there is around the pond. And when I say around the pond, I mean outside of the planting areas, the areas of the planting. And then we also looked at how much impervious surface there was in this buffer around the ponds. And it's a 50-meter buffer, think of about 150 feet. So what do we find? This is the influx rate of dissolved total phosphorus relative to impervious surfaces around the ponds. And what we saw was impervious surfaces increase the amount of dissolved total phosphorus coming into the pond. That makes sense, more water runoff, right? But we also saw that removal rate of dissolved total nitrogen decreased with impervious surfaces, okay? So it's not being removed as rapidly with more impervious surfaces for total nitrogen. We did see an effective vegetation, that NDVI measurement, and it was what we saw was removal rates of dissolved total nitrogen, the stuff in the pond, decreases with more vegetation in the areas around the pond, not the buffer zones that we're measuring, but the areas around the pond. And then removal of rate of particulate total phosphorus actually increases with more vegetation. And when we think about removal of particulate total phosphorus or total nitrogen, think of more of a settling out in the water column. So it's settling down to the bottom more than uptake of microbes or nutrients, or by plants or microbes, sorry. So, okay, so we saw some landscape effects. What were the effects of plants? Regarding the influx rate, the only thing we detected was the influx rate of dissolved total phosphorus increased when there was more lawn, okay, with greater lawn around the ponds. As regarding removal rates, the only thing we found was an effect of algae. The removal rate of particulate nitrogen and the removal rate of particulate total phosphorus, those particles floating around in the pond, decreased. So basically, with more algae, there's decreased settling of particles. The stuff settles out of the water column more slowly. But we did have one pond that had very high levels of algae in it, and we wanted to make sure that was not driving our results. So we removed that from our analysis and repeated the analysis. And what we found was a weaker evidence of the same effect on particulate total nitrogen, but really no effect now on particulate total phosphorus. So essentially, maybe with really high rates of algae, this is an issue. With lower rates of algae, maybe not so much. So a recap of what we found. High variability in removal rates for these metrics of or nutrients that we measured. So it's going to be difficult to predict even for a single pond how that pond is functioning. But we also found that ponds are not meeting the water quality goals, the 8 ponds that we measured. Regarding landscape context, we found with increased impervious surface, we found an increased influx in dissolved total phosphorus. We saw slower removal of dissolved total nitrogen. As far as vegetation goes, or the NDVI, we saw a slowed removal of dissolved total nitrogen, but increased settling of particulate phosphorus. Now, we don't necessarily know what's causing these relationships right now. But what we do know is it just communicates that what is happening in the landscape around the stormwater pond is going to contribute to how that pond functions. And that's what the big takeaway is here. As far as the plants, influx, more lawns can increase the influx of dissolved total phosphorus. And we found no effective buffer on removal or preventing nutrients from entering our pond. Here's a caveat though. We started sampling in June, and that was after a blackout period for Manatee and Sarasota counties. So in order to say that buffers don't have an effect on blocking nutrients from going in, I think we'd have to repeat or do another analysis that did capture that period when fertilizers were being applied. As far as removal goes, a lot of algae can slow down settling of particulate, total nitrogen, and total phosphorus, but it seems to be less of an issue for moderate amounts of algae. We saw no other effect of aquatic vegetation detected, okay? Now, Caveat, we only have 8 ponds. We can't make an inference about every stormwater pond in Florida from 8 ponds. And we do have high variability in our data set, right? So maybe we just didn't detect it with our low replication. But even with the high amount of variability, I suspect if this is a hypothesis here, my speculation, if we were to do 1,000 ponds, we might detect an effect, but I don't think it's going to be that 80% that we're looking for to help with removal. So next steps. We want to quantify the benefits of plantings on bank erosions. I think that's critical. We know they have helped with bank erosion. What are the long-term benefits to water quality and maintenance? We want to quantify the benefits of plant buffers when fertilizers are being applied to make sure that they are or are not helping. We haven't looked at the planting characteristics, like what was the planting age? What was the species composition? What were the traits of the plants that were in the pond? That's a lot of big questions. We also know that there's other benefits of stormwater pond planting, such as wildlife. People really like wildlife on their stormwater ponds. We can also make them, you look at attractive. There might be educational value as well from an environmental education standpoint in urban environments. Big question, what drives the variability that we see in nutrient removal? If we can answer that question, we can start to design better functioning stormwater ponds. And lastly, I think what this really points to is we need to think about what we're doing in the landscapes above those ponds to minimize nutrient inputs in the first place. With that, I'm going to hand this off to Dr. Paul Monaghan now, who's going to talk about the social dimensions of this study. Paul, you're muted.
How about that?
You're good.
Okay. Thanks, Rebecca. I'm so glad you're here. So good afternoon or good evening, everybody. I'm Paul Monaghan. I'm in the Department of Agricultural Education and Communication. I was helped out by my research assistants, Miranda and Anj, and of course, Michelle. I'm going to talk about 2 social science studies that we did as part of this research. And just to show you, the first part I'm going to talk about is these workshops that we conducted. And these are pictures from those workshops. And I do want you to note how many people turned out to talk about stormwater ponds, which you would think might be a boring subject. But I think because Michelle Atkinson invited them and offered this to folks, and they know and trust Michelle, they came out and they were enthusiastic about participating in this thing. So this does show that just the role of extension in extending information and engagement to our communities. So, and I'm not getting an advancement yet. Is that something I'm doing?
Click on this, click on the screen and
Gotta
then
click on the screen first. Still not. There we go. So these were the workshops that were called Let's Talk About Ponds. The idea then was to, we did a baseline survey with participants. They answered a Qualtrics survey. Then during the workshops, we gave them presentations, scientific background on both the function of ponds, but also some social science research I had done on perceptions and attitudes towards ponds. A big part of the workshops were working in small groups where they were directed with questions to share their knowledge of stormwater ponds, which we believe is eventually going to strengthen our extension programming. So in those small groups, these were the directions that we gave to people to both give them a chance to discuss, but also give us more questions that they had and to start thinking about solutions. And here are some of the questions that we asked. Did they think their stormwater ponds were polluted? And actually a majority did believe that their stormwater ponds were collecting pollutants from the neighboring landscape. And in their mind, yes, that they did have, because of those pollutants, that the ponds themselves were probably not clean, pristine water. We talked a lot about the issues they had dealt with and their continued questions. And we also speculated that if we changed planting styles to have a no-mow zone or a littoral planted zone or bank plantings, what kind of issues would they see, but also what would their neighbors think about it? And then at the end of the workshop, we actually went into the field. We took buses and cars and went out and observed these 3 different types of landscapes. And again, it was another chance for them to ask questions. We recorded all the questions that they asked, and we also got their feedback on what they thought of the planting styles, what was positive about it. What did they think their neighbors would think about it? Because we know that perceptions of neighbors are a big driver of whether somebody's going to accept change or not. This is a very dense slide, dense text slide, but I just wanted to summarize who we met with. They were older, highly educated, definitely upper middle class folks, mostly retirees. But the ones that came to these workshops did describe themselves as engaged in this issue. So they are not your average homeowner who doesn't know much about their pond, other than that they might complain about its condition or something. These were people that had, they might have been on their HOA, or they might have been on a landscape committee, or they had really talked to their neighbors about ponds, but they were engaged in the issue. Interestingly enough, they really felt connected to their ponds, and we asked them a question about, did the condition of their ponds personally affect them? And for these folks, yes, it did. And many of them, not surprisingly, when we asked them about the condition of their own pond and it was in poor condition, then they had higher levels of concern about nuisance algae, erosion, and invasive plants. So one of our conclusions, and it's not surprising, the more problems you're having with a stormwater pond, the more likely you are to be engaged in issues and seeking solutions. So some of the conclusions from the workshops. We do know that aesthetic preferences really play a huge role in it. If you have purchased a house on a stormwater pond, most likely you have paid a premium. You've paid more for it, somewhere upwards of 20 or 30% more in some cases. Okay. And if that pond was landscaped with turf to the edge, that's what you expect. And that's the kind of landscape that you would like to see maintained. Okay. I'm going to show you that our research does show there's quite a bit of openness towards new landscapes. But as you can see, or if you're involved in a community with an HOA, you know that certain individuals can actually dominate the conversation. And we find this to be true when it comes to changes in stormwater pond landscaping too. So like I said, a significant percentage of homeowners are open to landscape changes. When we showed them pictures and asked them to rank them, usually pictures with littoral or even full plantings were rated higher than turf grass to the edge. But then when we asked them what their neighbors would think, they actually overestimated how negative their neighbors would respond to it. Everybody kind of agreed that more knowledge about pond function is critical, but who really needs that knowledge? And I think this kind of gives an opportunity for cooperative extension. It's a combination of the homeowners, their homeowners association, there might be a management company above that. There's going to be contractors and pond managers and committees. All of these folks need to be both educated, but also talking about these issues and working out some of the complicated changes that are needed if we're going to improve the function of these ponds. Again, another text dense slide, but I apologize. I wanted to really give summaries of this research so you all would have some takeaways of it. While they were accepting of changes in pond landscaping, they have a lot of questions about their effectiveness, their cost, the cost of installation and maintenance, and this kind of skepticism can really make it difficult to kind of sell an alternative landscape to someone. Because of the data at this point, I think we're really in the early stages of understanding the effect of landscaping around ponds. There's no way to say definitively that investing in a changed landscape and buying plants and having them installed and maintained, there's no way to give a kind of a cost benefit analysis and say that this is gonna pay off. And again, going back to that idea of an HOA does have a responsibility for fiscal management, for responding to the needs of their community. And if you've got a product, in this case, and that's what we call behavior change, is really a product. If you've got a product that can't clearly promise these things, it's going to be difficult to sell it. And another thing we heard was that there's a lot of practical steps that we haven't worked out, or they may be unique to individual communities. In some cases, the developer still controls ponds and pond landscaping, so that's a different decision-making tree, if you will. In other communities, it's totally on the homeowners through their HOA, and then you also have to consider the contractors, those that might manage the ponds, whether a contractor manages the shoreline, and the contractors that manage the lawns that surround it. And all of those groups need to be talking and coordinating their actions to be successful. Again, what I mentioned, opportunities for change. So if your pond is not functioning either as it was designed or not functioning as you as a homeowner want it to, if it's clogged with the algae, we think that that's an opportunity to talk to people, to start to educate them about why they're having issues, to start to educate them about potential solutions, and then to start the dialogue about how we can actually implement these changes. Maybe we knew or had a hint of the importance of erosion when this project started, but it was mentioned so many times by homeowners as an issue that we really think maybe that is one of the leverage points we can use to promote change. And then also, we have to remember all these ponds, or many of these ponds in a neighborhood, are often connected to other ponds, and other landscapes are kind of draining into the pond. So it might be the owners that live on the ponds that have the loudest voices at the table, but it's their neighbors that are contributing phosphorus and nitrogen and organic matter to the pond. So again, going back to that dialogue among all the neighbors in a community. I'll briefly go over study number 2, and we have just starting to get the data back from this, and this is just some preliminary analysis of it. This is a survey of residents primarily from Lakewood Ranch. They're very similar to the folks that came to our workshops. high income, extremely high educational levels. They're homeowners and they live here year round, so they are engaged in this issue. I think the educational level shows kind of what kind of audience that we're going to reach out to with educational materials. So in that sense, we're lucky to have highly educated clientele. From the survey, a majority lived very close to their pond, or they could see it from their home. These folks, the majority, actually thought their ponds were in good or very good condition. They did tend to use their ponds mostly passively. They're visual amenity, and it's nice when the pond is calm and the sky is blue and the pond is blue. It really adds a lot to your viewscape. So there's not a lot of fishing or picnicking or things done around the pond, but they are noticed and appreciated. The folks that answered our questionnaire did not, in contrast to those who came to the workshops, did not have probably as much knowledge. They hadn't looked up information about stormwater ponds online. They had not talked to any of their committees or their decision makers locally, but they did talk to their neighbors about stormwater pond management. And again, I think this is a point that we can leverage. So if it's neighbor to neighbor discussions, maybe that's where we can target our educational materials. And then I'm going to give just quickly a couple of responses to particular questions that kind of show the issues that people have with stormwater ponds. If it's the more green there is, the more positive it is, right? So people were positive about the ability of plants to make the ponds healthier. That's the first one. They believed in the ability of the pond pond landscaping to reduce cost in the future, like through erosion. And they strongly believe that natural aesthetics are improved with plantings. So this is the belief about plantings among the people that took the survey. Now, when we asked them about my neighbors, we said, so most of my neighbors, and here you see the green bars are really shorter. And there's a lot less positive reaction when they're thinking about my neighbors. So do my neighbors want to invest money to improve the healthy environment? They don't expect that. They think that they disagree that their neighbors would want to help the environment. Would they be happier if plants improved the water quality of their ponds? Actually, that is a kind of a positive response. They do believe their neighbors care about water quality. That last question, would my neighbors like plants around our stormwater ponds? A lot of yellow there, which is, I don't really know. I don't want to say. And a little bit of red and orange, which show I strongly don't think my neighbors are going to like this. So there's a lot of room, I think, for both improvement, but also for change within those responses. Let me just, I want to make sure Michelle has enough time for this. Going back to that idea about if we do make these changes, will it result in the positive benefits that we hope it will? People are very, I think they're skeptical about that. Okay, will it save money and maintenance cost over time? I think people in that case are maybe hopeful that it will. When we ask, can I get in touch with people who make decisions regarding pond management in my community? They don't seem to have a lot of options. And again, maybe that's a role for extension to play. Let me go one more. And this is about my ability to promote change. And this might reflect kind of that decision-making, that hierarchical decision-making that takes place in an HOA. And did people believe that they could pay that they would pay a higher HO fee for their pond plantings if it saved money. I would say pretty much they're positive about that. That last question, it will be easy for me to advocate for decision makers. Again, they either did not want to say they were neutral on that, or they didn't, or they disagreed that they would be able to advocate effectively for changes. So there's a little bit of hesitancy about whether people can implement change or not. Let me just jump my conclusions. Stormwater ponds have a strong emotional, financial, and social effect on folks. They connect people with their neighbors, probably in ways they don't even know. The idea of ponds removing pollutants is largely invisible and probably has to be part of an educational program. Those decision-making structures, whether it's the HOA or the developer or contractors or managers, that has to be fully understood and clearly communicated. And again, when a pond is not working that well, that's really an opportunity for us as change agents, as extension agents and scientists to really step in and offer information and say, you know, there is an alternative that we can try, and we hope it works. And I'm going to leave it at that and give Michelle a chance to wrap it up, and also an opportunity for you all to ask questions. So thank you.
All right, Paul, thank you. So what did we look at? We looked at, as Basil explained, we quantified the effects of plantings on water quality. Unfortunately, it didn't show us what we were hoping for, what we hypothesized, but it did give us some good information. And we know that we also need to try to conduct this study during a time that fertilizer is being applied to see if that same result holds true. And then we also looked at people and perceptions, attitudes. What are the barriers? It sounds like, from what Paul was talking about, that neighbors, our fear of what our neighbors will think, are a huge barrier to us adopting this look of planted ponds. And so how do we overcome that? You know, we did find out that was one big barrier to accepting some of these looks of the ponds. Some lessons that we learned as we've been going throughout some of these studies, we know that irrigation is needed to establish, needed to establish irrigation. Hold on a second. I think Paul still has control.
Yeah,
okay, got it. That's okay. Now you're fine. So irrigation on those pond banks, it sounds weird, I know, but when you first put a plant in the ground, if there's not any rain happening, they're going to need some moisture. So just a temporary little irrigation system is really effective. Some pine straw mulch helps retain the moisture down to the root zones where it's needed. And while the plants are filling in, it will help reduce some of that weed pressure that can occur between the plants. But as we heard from Paul, and we learned the hard way in some cases, communication is extremely important. Communication among everybody. So communication between the landscape company and the pond company. You wouldn't think that, you know, the landscape company would need to be involved with this so much, but there are a number of things that affect their contract when we start making these changes. So they've been maintaining these ponds a certain way up to a certain area, and then we go putting plants in. When those plants are itty bitty, they may look like weeds to them, and they may try to spray them out. So we need to have them involved with the projects that we're doing from the get-go. We do know, even though plants weren't a huge benefit for water quality, we do know that they help with erosion. And erosion is one of the major concerns that we see in these stormwater ponds. So currently, planting is still encouraged to help with that erosion condition. So, you know, we can try to help you. If you're in Manatee County, talk to me. If you're in another county, contact your local extension agent to try to help you with some of these problems if you need some information or some resources. I am going to share some resources with you here in just a few minutes. But communicate. So have planning meetings among the pond maintenance, among the landscape maintenance, your HOA folks, the people that live around the ponds, the board, of course, any property management, get everybody involved. So that everybody's aware. We've had situations where there's been pond plantings that have happened and the homeowners have come out and removed the plants, saying that, you know, these weird plants popped up in my yard and I don't like them. And so they took them out. So everybody needs to know. And we don't want to spray out plants that we paid to install. I'm going to jump out of this PowerPoint real quick because I want to show you this website that we have. And you will also get, oh, look at that. You will also get the website link at the end of this. You're going to get some resources emailed to you as well as a recording of this presentation. So Paul and Basil, will you nod your heads if you can see the website now and not the PowerPoint? Okay, perfect. So this is the website. Let me get to the home page. This is what the homepage looks like. And we have a brand new publication I'm going to talk about in just a minute. We have some ideas of where to start. We've got videos and resources. Lots of information here. If you've never looked up your pond permit, there is all kinds of information located at the Water Management District, from the plans of when it was originally built to when it's been inspected. And then if you're local, we have some contacts of our local extension folks here. Up at the top, you can navigate to videos. We have, this is a presentation that I did for the Florida Friendly Landscaping Office on stormwater ponds, some things to think about, talking about as a homeowner, what you need to worry about, as an HOA board, what you need to worry about, and how they function and work, and then some looks of ponds that we've planted. We have some other videos here on green infrastructure and, you know, stormwater pond. This is Dr. Mark Clark, who is one of our gurus on stormwater and stormwater filtration through both ponds and wetlands. This is Dr. Evan Bean, who I hope is on with us tonight, but was involved with our study. And then we have a couple of other, this is the pond wave video that unfortunately the audio didn't work. And then some resources. So these are all fact sheets, and you can just click on the titles of the fact sheets and it will pull up whatever kind of information you're looking for. As you can see, there's lots of them listed here, even more down here. But then we have some grants, and this again is more if you're in this Tampa Bay, Sarasota Bay area for many of these, but there are some funding sources that can help you either with some of our estuary programs, or there is in Sarasota and Manatee, the START program gives money for plantings as well. So please navigate around this website to get some information. And I'm going to jump back to the PowerPoint and switch the display. Okay. So recently we were able to get published a fact sheet on frequently asked questions about stormwater wet ponds, and Anj and Miranda, who are the first authors on here, were instrumental in getting this out. Lots of contributors, but it's a long document because there's a lot of questions. Whoops, sorry. That's not the document. I was thinking this was the document. But if you scroll through the document itself, there's a lot to it because there are a lot of questions out there that people have. And so we've tried to address those for you. You'll find this on that front page of the Stormwater Pond website that you can link right to. Or if you go to our Ask IFAs and type in that number up there, that ACE 807, and this is coming to you in a link too, you'll find it. So ask IFAS, and then you just type in our fact sheet number and you'll find it, or do a search on stormwater ponds. We don't have a whole lot of fact sheets out there, but you'll find it here on stormwater ponds. So here's one that Basil had some students that worked on this. Him and Evan Bean put this together, and it is a database of plants that you can go through. It's actually on an Excel spreadsheet, and you can sort it by aesthetics, things that are pretty, or function, or wildlife value. So you can sort these plants according to what you're looking to do around your pond. It's got some colors pictures. It's got some information if it's, you know, like a butterfly, a tractor or whatever. So you'll find lots of information in this database, and these would be the appropriate plants to plant in that area. We also have a newer publication on common pollutants in stormwater runoff, and then things that you as a homeowner can do to help reduce some of that pollution entering the stormwater system. So I'm going to take a minute here to say a lot of people in our area have reclaimed water for irrigation and feel like because it's reclaimed water that it is open and free to use as much as they want. Unfortunately, reclaimed water does have a lot of nitrogen and phosphorus in it. And when we over irrigate our landscapes, it runs off and it enters into these ponds. So it can either run off directly from your landscape, but even if you don't live on a pond, it runs off into your stormwater system down the street into the stormwater drain. And there is not any filter from that stormwater drain to the stormwater pond. It will flow right in there, and all those nutrients go with it. So we need to be really careful with our irrigation, especially when we have reclaimed water. We have a program that we launched and then we've held back for a couple of years, and it's relaunching this spring, and it's Florida Friendly Ponds. This is currently a certification program for pond maintenance professionals, and it is an 8-week program that they would go through and then get a certificate. We teach them about a lot of things about ponds, including, you know, the water testing and the aquatic life that's in there, managing problems, a lot of things that they may not get other places. These are for the techs that come out and service your stormwater ponds. So in the future, I would love to say, make sure your pond maintenance contractor has this certification. Maybe soon in the future, you can start writing it into your contract that they have this certification, because we really talk about the whole pond and looking holistically at everything, not just, oh, there's algae, I'm going to kill the algae, and not think about what other things I'm affecting when I kill that algae, because it can affect a lot of other things. So looking at this pond more holistically to manage them. So a new study that we have been working on, we're still in the beginning stages, is this really interesting study that we have the regulatory, the communities, and the individuals, and those folks make the management decisions for ponds. So that's the B part. So we have A, they make the decisions, the management decisions for those two ponds. There's a blue pond at the top and a green pond at the bottom. Nobody likes the green pond, but the blue pond is the clear pond at the top. So we're making these decisions, and that comes to C. So these ponds have services, they remove pollutants. There's other services that they provide too, some wildlife, and there's some really good benefits from ponds. A secondary service that we're starting to focus more on is the property value related to ponds. And is there better property values with those clear ponds versus those green ponds? So we get to E, which means people in the C pond, the clear pond, they're pretty happy. So the outcome is matching their values. So it's kind of just a circular system. As long as that pond stays clear, they're happy about that. But then we have the green pond, where it may not be removing as many pollutants because it's overloaded. It may not have as good of wildlife habitat. And then it gets to where those folks don't appreciate that pond. And so then it may have to get back to a regulatory stance, or the community has to get involved and find a new contractor, or get after the contractor, or that homeowner has to get after somebody and figure out what's going on. But management decisions are what's impacting these ponds. How we manage them has a huge impact. And so that's what we're really looking at, and how we can impact better decisions that we as humans make on these ponds. You know, what's it going to take? We already know that we're really afraid of our neighbors and what they think. So what can we do to overcome some of these things and still have our pretty ponds, but the ponds still function in a way that we need them to, and we still have good property values and wildlife benefits and all. So it's a really big study. There's a lot of people involved with it. I'm really excited about this, as are all the researchers involved. Start communicating with us. Communication is a huge, huge thing. In the resources that you're going to get at the end of this webinar will be our Slack page. You can, if you want, take a picture, try to take a picture of this. It'll lead you to the website of the QR code, but our Slack page is free. We're not using some of the other social media platforms like Facebook and all, because, there's been some news about that. So Slack, as far as we understand, is still a pretty safe place to communicate, not advertising or anything like that takes place there. So free, come join our community. It's a stormwater pond community where folks ask questions and we try to provide answers. We just would discourage anybody getting very specific about specific companies or products, because we are with government and the University of Florida, and we can't promote any one service. So you can't get on and say, hey, this contractor is really good. And, you would need to chat individually with somebody if that's the case, but not in the whole group. We would delete those kind of conversations, but we would welcome you to start communicating with us. The questions that you ask, the problems that you have, the problems that I hear about is what helps drive research, because the two wonderful professors that are on this webinar, I've been working with them a long time, and they know that I'm not afraid to say, hey, this is a problem over here, and we need to kind of look at this if we can, and maybe we need to find some grants to try to look at this. So let your extension folks know what the issues are so that we can try to help address some of those things. Okay, so with that, I do want to open this up for the questions that have been answered. I see that there's some on here, and I'll kind of moderate and ask those questions and see who wants to answer those questions. But while we're doing that, I'm going to ask that our wonderful background person, Rebecca, go ahead and launch our poll. Now, what's going to happen is there's going to be a poll that pops up on your screen, and it's going to ask questions. Be sure that you hit that little bar on the right-hand side and scroll down through. There are 10 questions that we would love to get answers from you. We are hoping to learn more as we do these workshops about people and their perceptions. We're also trying to get some support for some more staff that can help us look at these stormwater pond issues. So answering surveys like this can help with those efforts. So if you could please start answering those questions, and I'm going to pull up the questions here. The first one that we have is, what is the best way to reclaim a pond that is overgrown along the edge and even several feet into the water? So we've got probably torpedo grass, I'm betting, or maybe cattails, probably torpedo grass. And so they're, Paul or Basil, do you want to take a stab at that, or do you want me to go for it?
At first I'd ask let's think about what that function of that vegetation is doing right now, right? It sounds like it's probably stabilizing the bank, right? But Michelle brought up the point that it could be an invasive plant, and without knowing that, you'd have to look at some of the control strategies for aquatic invasive species, which we have you can ask IFAs and look at what those species are. But removing it all at one time might be, you might end up having to deal with like erosion issues in the future if you don't replant it with something else more beneficial if it's an invasive species. So I would definitely look up some of the control strategies for invasive plants, but also have a plan to reestablish plants so you get that function back of the bank stabilization. Is that, anyone else say anything to add?
No, that sounds about right. Unfortunately, it sometimes takes the crew that's doing the work to get in there and hand remove some of it and then treat, so that you don't have such a big treatment that you have to do too, just depending on what it is. Okay, so how beneficial would cordgrass plantings included in the low mow zone be for stormwater ponds? Well, for the erosion control, it is beneficial. However, we have learned that with cordgrass, you'll need to have some other plants mixed in. Sometimes people do what we call a monoculture or just only plant cordgrass. And what can happen is when we have those clumps of the cordgrass, the water will find its way around those clumps and actually make channels that cause some erosion there between the channels. So we really would encourage some kind of a ground cover that could creep in and among that cordgrass. So you get that roots covering all of the bank to help stabilize. Basil, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I want to add to that. You brought up the idea of the multiple species, and that's really important, I think. If you're thinking about stormwater pond plantings, oftentimes people like to plant plants in clumps because they look nice. But if you have like a pest come in or the plant dies, then you lose that function that the plant provided in a large area. And I think it's important to start to think about maybe having multiple species, as Michelle. That's like kind of a thing with biodiversity. More species provides, it helps to stabilize function in ecosystems. So I think that would be very valuable sort of perspective to think about as well when if you do want to just plant stormwater ponds, but yes.
Okay, thanks. From a regulatory standpoint, is there any talk of requiring quick release fertilizer versus slow release around these ponds in the future to avoid excess nitrogen and phosphorus input? So I have not heard of any kind of regulatory talk on quick release around a pond. Actually, we say no fertilizer around a pond, and the plants that we recommend that you put in that pond area are native mostly or very Florida friendly and don't require fertilizer because we wouldn't want to fertilize in that area and risk it getting into the water. Anyone want to add to that?
No, I would have to, I think isn't slow release promoted for lawns around ponds anyway because of the slow release function helps with preventing rapid movement. Is that kind of the idea?
That is the idea, right? So it releases slowly for the plants and turf to absorb it, take it in instead of a real quick release that it can't necessarily take up entirely.
Yeah,
So,
and turf grass is actually surprisingly good at taking up nutrients when it's able to, if it's not too fast. So yeah.
yeah, so we have a best management practice of no fertilizing within 10 feet of a stormwater pond is what we ask unless you have a deflector shield. And if you have one of those which keeps the fertilizer from being sprayed or those little granules being thrown, then we say 4 feet from the pond with a deflector shield. Okay, will it be better to spread the pond plants around peripherally or the periphery of the pond, in particularly at the inflow location of the pond? Plants near the inflow will allow uptake of the nutrients more efficiently, and particularly in the very large ponds. The practice of concentrating all the plants in a single littoral shelf at the outfall control structure may not be the best practice, as the nutrients will contact the littoral zone only when there is a rain event, but water will be moving too fast over the plants for efficient uptake.
Yeah.
So Basil, you want to go ahead on that?
Yeah. That's a great question. So I think what the person's asking is if we put a lot of plants where the water is coming into the pond, it can probably allow that water. It'll first of all, it'll promote sedimentation, more rapid sedimentation, because of a physical structure there. But then they're suggesting that it will also help with uptake of nutrients relative to putting the plants at the outflow, where the water is already rushing by the plants very quickly to get out of the pond. And for everyone who knows, I didn't get into this too much, but the general design of a stormwater pond is it does have an overflow structure because its first priority is to prevent flooding. So if that pond fills up too high and there's concern about houses being flooded, the water flows into the overflow structure and down to another water body, because that's the primary goal, is to prevent flooding. We don't want to decrease that function. Now, what I will say to this individual is, just for our study, we didn't just have plantings at the outflows in our ponds. They were all throughout the pond. And there's some challenges with hydrology in stormwater ponds. People like to think of them as an inflow pipe and outflow pipes. But what we're really learning is there's also overland flow from all the directions in the pond. And then there's also subsurface flow of water going on that we're not really understanding. So I like this idea, and I think it raises the question of, where can we plant plantings to maximize their benefit for sedimentation? Now, regarding the nutrient removal, one thing I will add is plants do remove nutrients, but one of the things we really need to know is the microbial communities that associate with plants actually have a much bigger impact on removal rates than plants do. There's a joke among, microbial ecologists and fungal ecologists, mycologists, that joke that say roots are there for microbes to live on, right? So the plants are an important component, but I think we have to also look at that ecology of what's living on the plants. But the placement idea is a really good idea, that we can probably place these plants more strategically. That has to go back to the drawing board of actually designing the pond, though, with putting the littoral shelf in the correct locations and things like that. The earlier engineer design. Michelle, Paul, anything else to add?
Well, so I'm not seeing the littoral shelf design as much anymore. Now the littoral is all the way around the edge of the pond, not just gathered in one spot. It used to be that it had to be 30% of the pond surface, and it was at that outflow structure area. But now the littoral shelf is really all the way around the edge of the pond. I would be a little careful with planting a lot of plants at the inflow, because you could end up choking up the flow. And that, when we're having a storm event, you want some flow, as we found out this year specifically. So I would be careful, stacking a lot of plants there, but definitely on the edges around that area. And they can creep into the pond that way.
Yeah, and thanks for clarifying that point about we cannot prohibit the flow in these things, because that will, again, take away the key function of flood control.
Right. So we did have a couple of questions that we might want to just kind of go over, because they were answered in print, and I'm going to do that. But I do want to just say quickly that if you are in or around Manatee County, we do have a wetlands demonstration area in our Master Gardener's Garden, and our wonderful volunteer Master Gardeners helped me pull out a bunch of bulrush the other day. So if you're in the area and you would like to pick up some bulrush for your pond, just send me a little message and I'll have them all packed up with a little fact sheet on how to plant them, what they do, their function, everything. And you can come pick them up. I have 4 totes full of bulrush, so I've got quite a lot of it, that you're welcome to. Just let me know, and that you're coming, and I'll have it ready for you. Okay, so some things that were answered. Let's see, those were pretty specific. We have this was a good one. What about how can we get this information out to our neighbors who are not up to date on this research, or who have a typical view of stormwater ponds?
Paul?
I would print out a copy of that EDIS document, the extension fact sheet, about frequently asked questions about stormwater ponds, and maybe start with that and just have a conversation about the information that's in that document. I think that's a great place to start.
And I would encourage you as well, if you are in an HOA, if there is any kind of newsletter or communication that they send out to their homeowners, that they could put a link to that document in their newsletter, that there's some new research about stormwater ponds and some, questions answered. So that would be a great thing. Sometimes we extension agents even can help write articles for some of those. So you can reach out to us if you need articles for those newsletters. But yeah, I would say definitely share the information with your neighbor if you can, and also with the HOA as a whole, because people are not understanding some of this information.
We will be having this talk uploaded to the Center for Land Use Efficiency's YouTube channel as well, so as a resource.
Okay, so you could share the whole presentation with them. Okay, looking forward. Okay, I was just looking through the questions that we answered to see if there's any that need to be covered. It looks like we've covered the questions here. Oh, we've got 2 more here. I've observed that ponds are higher than they used to be in my area, even though we have not had rain for weeks. Why? Do king tides prevent soil precipitation, silted ponds from erosion? So the ponds are higher than they used to be, even though they have not had rain for weeks. If you're in my area, the ponds are still holding water from the storms that we had. The soils were so saturated and so much water came in that they were holding. And now when we do get a little bit of rain, well, it's starting to open. The soils are starting to dry up again, but for a while, whenever we did get rain, it would just run right off because the soils were so saturated. So the storms may have something to do with it. King tides are having an effect if you're in a coastal area. Yes, we do have the reverse flow of stormwater when we have a king tide, especially if you're on the island or on the coastal areas, you'll see that happening. And silted ponds from erosion. I don't know if that would be okay, so the ponds, what he's saying is it's more shallow, so the water level might be higher. Typically when the pond erodes like that, it also gets a little wider. So I'm not sure if that's necessarily the reason, but king tides can, and definitely some of the storm events are still kind of lingering out there. The other thing I would say, because I had this happen in a community recently, is that the outflow was not working properly. It wasn't functioning properly. And when we looked at it closely, the design actually wasn't correct. And so it was too high up. So it wasn't draining the pond as it should. So make sure that the outflow is functioning properly. And with that, we got a question on inflow and outflow. Could you explain where to observe these?
Yes, I can. And in fact, I'm trying to open up a slide so I can almost show you a picture of it because I didn't put it on this slide. If I hopefully I have it readily available, and I don't want to slow up the presentation here. All right, here, let's look at this. Can I share my screen, Michelle? Or am I able to do that?
Yeah, I'm going to stop sharing and you should be able to share.
All right. Yeah. Okay, so let's see if I can do this. Yeah, okay. Hopefully you can see that. So
Yes.
there's 2 different types of stormwater ponds in general. There's the wet ponds that we are talking about today, but there's also dry retention ponds where the water goes in, it stays there permanently and filters down through the soil. And I apologize, I'm getting a cold. So regarding inflows, sometimes they're very difficult to see. They're pipes under the water and you're not able to see them, but you can get clues as to where they are based on where storm drains are around the pond. Because if there's a storm drain around the pond that's running off, it probably runs into the pond. So that's a little bit difficult to see sometimes for the stormwater ponds. And in fact, the engineering can be pretty complex where you end up with getting more pipes in there than you actually see from the drains. But as far as overflow structures go, they can be seen pretty readily. And here's one right here where there's this like drain. And if the water were to get up to that, this barrier around it, blocks things from, helps keep the drain from clogging. It'll flow into that drain and then out to another body of water. Another mechanism that they have is, sorry, let me zoom in on this. I realize it's probably small on your screen. Like right here, you can see this. It's a weir. It's basically just a board, essentially, that's just there. And then when the water gets above it, it starts to slowly flow out. So that's things to look for, and it's a clear sign if you see an overgrown body of water as to whether or not it was an engineered ecosystem or maybe a natural one, because you'll see those outflow structures. So.
And the inflows are just typically a pipe that are coming into the pond, and it's draining, or it's coming often from the roads around that drain and just drain right into that pond. So the pond takes not only the homeowner that lives on the pond's stormwater, but also, you know, the community stormwater. So there'll be a pipe coming in, and depending on the age of the pond, the outflow structures have changed. That's more of the new style, what Basil was showing with the spillovers and all. But the old ones, some of them were direct pipes. So you had an, let's see if you can see my hand, an inflow pipe coming here and an outfall pipe up here, but it was just a straight pipe. So in some of those older ponds, you might just see a pipe too.
Be able to see it, yeah.
Yeah. So about the heavy rains in Duval County, you didn't get heavy rains. So I would check those outfall structures and see what's going on with those if you have high ponds and you didn't have the heavy rains. Because this time of year, you shouldn't be holding a lot of water. The other thing is some ponds are actually, and maybe you would know, maybe you don't know, some ponds get recharged. They're hooked to wells or reclaimed water, and the community wants to keep an aesthetic and keep the pond at a certain level. And so sometimes those are hooked to those recharge device or water sources. And you know, you want to make sure that those are functioning properly and not putting too much in. Okay, is it typical for the roadway storm drains to be inspected regularly?
I don't know.
Okay.
Yeah, Michelle, you probably know more than me on that, but
Yeah, so that can be, it should be kind of tied into that permit. If there's a problem, your stormwater pond inspector should kind of go back and make sure that those drains are functioning properly. But another concern that I have about those drains is more what all gets into them. And we should be really street sweeping to try to keep stuff out of them as much as we can, especially when we have those big leaf drops in the spring and the fall. So trying to keep them as clean as possible. If that's what you're referring to, like who's coming out and inspecting to make sure they're not clogged up? Nobody. If you're in an HOA, that is the responsibility of either your community development district, the CDD, or it's the responsibility of the HOA, because they're probably not county roads if it's within an HOA. If it's a county road, then we do come, Manatee County does come occasionally, but occasionally is like sometimes when there's a problem and somebody's complaining, to be honest with you. It's not something that's regularly done. So if there's a problem, report it, please. In Manatee County, you can call 311 to report any problems like that. I'm sure in other counties you have different ways to report, but report those kinds of things so that they can get it fixed, because that can help with some reduction of nutrient going in.
can I add to something there?
Please, please.
So, Michelle brought up a really important point. One of the easiest things we can do to prevent nutrients from getting into our stormwater ponds is when we are raking leaves or mowing lawns, to make sure those grass clippings and those leaves do not end up running into the pond through the stormwater drain. It's a really easy thing to do, to blow the leaf litter or the grass clippings back up onto your lawn or into your flower beds for mulch, rather than having them go down. And that's something that I see landscaping companies still doing. It drives me nuts. You'll see them blowing leaves down into drains, and that stuff gets into the water. And Mary Lusk has shown this, where lots of oak leaves get into ponds, and that adds nutrients to the water, right? And so we usually think about fertilizers. We don't think about the natural sort of plant material, but keep that on your landscape and try to prevent it from going into the stormwater drains. And it's a really sort of simple, easy thing to do that everyone can achieve that, so yeah. Excellent.
Certainly. Okay, well, we're out of questions.
Well,
So I believe we've come to the end. Thank you so much to everyone for wonderful questions and your attention tonight. We do really appreciate you being on with us and sticking it out till the end. Again, let me know if you want some bulrush, just send me an email. Thanks for filling out our poll. And Basil, Paul, do you want to add anything?
No, thank you for being here. Oh, and I forget if I thanked people in the beginning. There a lot of people I saw who signed up actually helped us to identify ponds that were useful for the study, helped us with putting up equipment, helped with workshops. I just can't thank you enough for everything you contributed. And if I didn't thank you in the beginning because I forgot, I apologize. I should have. All right. So yeah, thank you very much.
All right. Well, thanks everybody. And so again, you'll get emailed to you a recording of this presentation along with some resources that you can click on, including that stormwater pond website, some Florida friendly information, and join us on the Slack page and keep the conversation going. All right. So thanks everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
thank you.